The morning fog was just lifting off San Francisco Bay when I walked into Meridian Technologies for what I thought would be just another routine day. The sleek glass building on Montgomery Street housed one of the city's most prestigious tech consulting firms, and at 26, I was grateful to have landed what everyone assumed was an entry-level position there. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Chen, and for the past 8 months, I'd been working at Meridian under circumstances that were far more complex than anyone in that office could have imagined. You see, while everyone believed I was Sarah Chen, the friendly girl from the coffee station who somehow knew an unusual amount about business strategy, the truth was considerably more interesting. I graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with dual degrees in computer science and business administration. My thesis on emerging market penetration strategies had been published in 3 different academic journals. I spoke 4 languages fluently and had spent 2 years working for a boutique consulting firm in Singapore before returning to the States. But none of my colleagues at Meridian knew any of this. The reason for my deception was simple. I was conducting an undercover assessment of the company for a potential acquisition. My real employer, Blackstone Ventures, was considering purchasing Meridian Technologies, and they needed someone on the inside to evaluate the company's culture, efficiency, and management structure. What better way to observe than to blend in as a low-level employee? My cover story was perfect. I was supposedly a recent community college graduate who needed a job to pay off student loans. I'd intentionally dumbed down my resume, listed a fake educational background, and even practiced speaking in a slightly less polished manner. The coffee station assignment was ideal. It put me in contact with employees from every department while keeping me relatively invisible. For 8 months, I'd been the girl who knew everyone's coffee order by heart. I remembered that Marcus from accounting liked his espresso with exactly 2 sugars, that Jennifer from HR preferred her latte extra hot, and that the executives on the 15th floor all had their own specific quirks when it came to their morning caffeine fix. But there was one person whose coffee order I knew better than anyone else's, and he was the reason this particular morning was about to become unforgettable. Derek Whitman Jr. was the 31-year-old son of Meridian CEO Derek Whitman Jr., as everyone called him behind his back, had been handed a vice president position the moment he graduated from USC with what I'd learned was a barely passing GPA. He was tall, blonde, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to prove yourself. Every morning at precisely 8:47 a.m., Derek Jr. would stride past the coffee station in his perfectly pressed Armani suit, barely glancing in my direction as he barked out his order. Large black coffee, extra shot, make it fast. Never a please, never a thank you, never even acknowledgement that I was a human being rather than a coffee dispensing machine. But Derek Jr.'s dismissive attitude went far beyond simple rudeness. Over the months, I'd overheard him talking to his colleagues about the coffee girl in ways that made my skin crawl. He'd refer to me as that little nobody or the community college dropout. Once during a particularly busy morning, I'd overheard him telling his assistant, "Just send the coffee girl to grab lunch for the meeting. It's not like she's doing anything important." The irony wasn't lost on me. While Derek Jr. spent his days playing executive, attending meetings where he contributed little more than his father's name, I was quietly documenting every inefficiency, every cultural problem, and every leadership failure in the company. My real job was to determine whether Meridian Technologies was worth the $150 million Blackstone was considering paying for it. And Derek Jr. was quickly becoming Exhibit A in my case for why the company was overvalued. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. I arrived at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the office officially opened, and began my routine of setting up the coffee station. The industrial-grade espresso machine hummed to life, and I arranged the cups, stirrers, and condiments with the same precision I'd been maintaining for 8 months. At 8:15, the first wave of employees began trickling in. I greeted each of them with the same warm smile I'd perfected, asking about their weekends, their families, their projects. These conversations weren't just pleasantries, they were intelligence gathering. Every casual comment about departmental conflicts, every frustrated sigh about management decisions, every excited mention of new projects went into my mental database. Margaret from finance mentioned that the quarterly numbers were looking shaky. Tom from IT complained about the outdated server infrastructure that Derek Sr. kept refusing to upgrade. Lisa from marketing whispered about the major client they were worried about losing due to Derek Jr.'s handling of the account. All of this information was gold for my assessment, but I filed it away with the same pleasant smile I gave everyone else. At 8:47 a.m. exactly, I heard the familiar sound of expensive Italian leather shoes clicking across the marble floor. Derek Jr. was approaching, and I could already see the look on his face, that mixture of impatience and superiority that had become as predictable as his coffee order. "Large black coffee, extra shot. Make it fast," he said without looking up from his phone. "And this time, try not to make it taste like dishwater." I bit back the dozen responses that came to mind and simply said, "Of course, Mr. Whitman, coming right up." As I prepared his coffee, I noticed he was having what seemed to be a tense phone conversation. His voice was low, but I caught fragments. "The Peterson account is fine. Dad, I know what I'm doing. Trust me on this one." The Peterson account. I knew that name well. Peterson Industries was Meridian's largest client, representing nearly 30% of their annual revenue. According to my research, Derek Jr. had been put in charge of the relationship 6 months ago, despite having no prior experience managing accounts of that magnitude. I handed him his coffee with the same polite smile I always wore. "Here you go, Mr. Whitman. Have a great day." He grabbed the cup without acknowledgement and continued his phone conversation as he walked away. But as he reached the elevator, I heard him say something that made my blood run cold. "Look, Dad, I don't care what the old man Peterson thinks. We're the best firm in the city, and if he doesn't like our new pricing structure, he can take his business elsewhere. There are plenty of other companies that would kill to work with us." My heart sank. Having spent considerable time researching the Peterson account, I knew that Peterson Industries was notoriously price-sensitive and had been considering switching to a competitor for months. Derek Jr. was essentially playing chicken with their most important client. And from what I'd observed of his personality, he was exactly the type of person who would drive that relationship straight off a cliff. As the elevator doors closed behind him, I realized that today might be the day everything changed. I'd been at Meridian for 8 months quietly observing and documenting, but I'd never seen Derek Jr. make such a potentially catastrophic mistake in real time. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of coffee orders and casual conversations, but my mind was racing. I needed to find out more about what was happening with the Peterson account. My final report to Blackstone was due in 2 weeks, and this could be the smoking gun that definitively answered whether Meridian was worth acquiring. Around 10:30 a.m., I overheard Jennifer from HR talking to her colleague about an emergency board meeting that had been called for Thursday morning. "Apparently, there's some kind of crisis with one of our major clients," she said, her voice tinged with worry. Derek Sr. looked furious when he came in this morning. My pulse quickened. An emergency board meeting could only mean one thing. The Peterson situation had escalated beyond Derek Jr.'s inability to handle it. As I continued serving coffee and maintaining my cover, I began formulating a plan. The board meeting would be held in the executive conference room on the 15th floor, the same floor where I delivered afternoon refreshments every Tuesday and Thursday. If I could position myself correctly, I might be able to observe the meeting and gather crucial intelligence for my report. But what I didn't know was that this emergency board meeting would change everything. Not just for my assessment of Meridian Technologies, but for my entire carefully constructed identity at the company. The afternoon crawled by as I waited for my scheduled refreshment delivery to the 15th floor. At 2:30 p.m., I loaded up my cart with coffee, bottled water, and an assortment of pastries from the expensive bakery that Meridian kept on retainer for executive meetings. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual, my heart pounding with anticipation. The executive conference room was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Through the frosted glass walls, I could see the silhouettes of several people moving around, their voices raised in what sounded like heated discussion. I took my time setting up the refreshment station just outside the conference room, hoping to catch fragments of conversation. What I heard made my stomach drop. Peterson Industries has officially terminated their contract effective immediately. 30% of our annual revenue. This is a disaster. Derek Jr.'s voice cut through the others, defensive and angry. This isn't my fault. Peterson was being completely unreasonable about the pricing. Any other CEO would have made the same decision. I heard Derek Sr.'s voice, tight with barely controlled fury. Any other CEO wouldn't have insulted their largest client, and then threatened to drop them first. The door to the conference room opened, and Margaret from finance rushed out looking pale and shaken. She barely noticed me as she hurried past, muttering something about damage control and emergency financial projection. I realized I was witnessing the aftermath of exactly what I'd feared that morning. Derek Jr. had torpedoed the Peterson account, and now the entire company was in crisis mode. As I finished arranging the refreshments, I couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. For 8 months I'd been invisible to Derek Jr., just the coffee girl who wasn't worth his time or respect. He had no idea that I'd been watching, analyzing, and documenting every mistake he made. And now, as I prepared to leave Meridian and deliver my final report to Blackstone, I realized that Derek Jr.'s arrogance and incompetence had essentially made my job for me. There was no way Blackstone would acquire a company that had just lost 30% of its revenue due to executive mismanagement. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off, but the story was far from over. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday, and I had a feeling that it would be unlike anything Meridian Technologies had ever seen. What Derek Jr. didn't know was that his dismissive treatment of the coffee girl was about to come back to haunt him in the most spectacular way possible. Wednesday morning arrived with an unusual tension hanging over the Meridian Technologies office. Word had spread quickly about the Peterson Industries disaster, though most employees only knew fragments of the story. I watched from my position at the coffee station as clusters of worried workers whispered in hallways and gathered around water coolers, their conversations dying abruptly whenever someone from management walked by. The atmosphere was electric with anxiety, and I found myself in the unique position of knowing more about the situation than almost anyone in the building. My dual role as both invisible observer and highly trained business analyst gave me insights that even some of the executives lacked. Derek Jr. arrived that morning, looking like he hadn't slept. His usually pristine appearance was slightly disheveled, his tie was crooked, his hair wasn't perfectly styled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that even his expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. When he approached the coffee station, he didn't even bother with his usual demanding tone. "Coffee," he muttered, barely making eye contact. "Large black with an extra shot?" I asked, maintaining my cheerful demeanor despite the obvious stress radiating from him. He nodded curtly and stood there while I prepared his drink, tapping his fingers impatiently on the counter. I could see his phone screen lighting up constantly with incoming calls and messages, most of which he was ignoring. As I handed him the coffee, our eyes met briefly, and for just a moment I saw something I'd never seen before in Derek Jr.'s expression: genuine worry. The cocky confidence that had defined his personality for the 8 months I'd known him had cracked, revealing the insecure man underneath. "Thanks," he said quietly, which was perhaps the first time he'd ever expressed gratitude for anything I'd done. After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was brewing. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, but the undercurrent of panic in the office suggested that the Peterson situation was just the tip of the iceberg. My suspicions were confirmed around 11 a.m. when I overheard a conversation between 2 senior managers from the strategy department. They were discussing the cascade effect of losing the Peterson account, how it would impact their ability to secure other major clients, how it would affect their credit rating, and most importantly, how it would influence any potential acquisition offers. The irony wasn't lost on me. These executives were worried about acquisition offers, while having no idea that I was there specifically to evaluate them for exactly that purpose. And Derek Jr.'s spectacular failure with Peterson Industries had essentially sealed their fate. Throughout the day, I continued my intelligence gathering, but with a growing sense that my time at Meridian was coming to an end. The coffee station gave me access to conversations from every department, and the picture they painted was increasingly grim. The accounting team was scrambling to revise quarterly projections. The sales team was fielding calls from nervous clients who had heard rumors about the Peterson situation. The marketing department was trying to craft damage control strategies, and through it all, Derek Jr. was nowhere to be seen after his brief appearance that morning. By Wednesday afternoon, I had compiled enough information to write a comprehensive report that would definitively answer Blackstone's questions about Meridian Technology. The company was hemorrhaging money, plagued by poor leadership, and now facing a crisis that threatened its very survival. There was no way any rational investor would acquire them at their current asking price. That evening, I sat in my downtown apartment, staring at my laptop screen as I began typing my final report. The document would effectively end my 8-month assignment at Meridian, but it would also expose the fundamental flaws in the company's management structure that Derek Jr. embodied. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about the dozens of small humiliations I'd endured over the past months. The dismissive comments, the condescending looks, the way Derek Jr. had treated me like furniture rather than a human being. Tomorrow's board meeting would be my last day at Meridian, and I realized I had mixed feelings about leaving. On one hand, I was eager to drop the pretense and return to my real career. On the other hand, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that Derek Jr. was about to face the consequences of his actions, even if he would never know the role I'd played in documenting his failures. Thursday morning dawned gray and drizzly, with San Francisco's famous fog rolling in from the bay. I arrived at Meridian earlier than usual, knowing that this would be my final day in the role of Sarah Chen, coffee station attendant. The building felt different somehow, charged with an energy that suggested major changes were coming. The coffee station was busier than usual, with employees stopping by not just for their morning caffeine fix, but for the comfort of routine in an increasingly uncertain environment. I served each customer with the same warm smile I'd maintained for 8 months, but my mind was already shifting into the analytical mode I'd need for the board meeting. At 8:30 a.m., I received a text message that made my heart skip a beat. It was from James Mitchell, my handler at Blackstone Ventures. Change of plans. Board meeting moved to 9 a.m. You need to be there. Full disclosure authorized. Good luck. I read the message 3 times before its implications sank in. Blackstone wasn't just asking me to observe the board meeting. They were authorizing me to reveal my true identity and present my findings directly to Meridian's board of directors. This changed everything. I quickly began cleaning up the coffee station, my hands trembling slightly as I processed what was about to happen. In less than 30 minutes, I would walk into that boardroom, not as the invisible coffee girl, but as Sarah Chen, senior business analyst for Blackstone Ventures. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt surreal. I'd made this journey dozens of times over the past 8 months, always as the helpful employee delivering refreshments to important meetings I wasn't supposed to understand. Today I was going to be the most important person in that room. The executive conference room was already bustling with activity when I arrived. Through the frosted glass walls I could see the silhouettes of Meridian's senior leadership team, their body language tense and defensive. Derek Sr. was pacing at the head of the table, his voice carrying through the walls as he spoke in sharp, clipped tones. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders and walked toward the conference room door. The secretary outside looked up in surprise as I approached. "Excuse me, miss, but this is a private board meeting," she said, clearly recognizing me as the coffee station employee. "I'm aware," I replied, my voice automatically shifting to the professional tone I'd been suppressing for 8 months. "I'm Sarah Chen from Blackstone Ventures. I believe I'm expected." The secretary's eyes widened in confusion, but before she could respond, the conference room door opened and Derek Sr. emerged. His face was grave, and he looked like a man who had aged several years in the past few days. "Miss Chen?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Yes, sir. I'm here to present Blackstone's findings regarding the potential acquisition of Meridian Technologies." Derek Sr.'s expression shifted from confusion to understanding, to something that looked almost like relief. "Please, come in. We've been expecting you." As I walked into the conference room, I felt the weight of 8 months of careful observation and analysis settling on my shoulders. The room fell silent as the board members turned to look at me, their faces showing various degrees of surprise and confusion. And there, sitting at the far end of the table, was Derek Jr. His reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The coffee cup in his hand seemed to freeze halfway to his lips, his eyes widening in complete shock as he processed what he was seeing. The coffee girl he'd dismissed and belittled for 8 months was walking into his father's boardroom as an equal, no, as someone with significantly more power than he had. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice clear and confident. "My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a senior business analyst with Blackstone Ventures. For the past 8 months, I've been conducting an undercover assessment of Meridian Technologies on behalf of my firm." The silence in the room was deafening. Derek Jr.'s face had gone completely pale, and I could see him struggling to process the reality of the situation. The woman he'd treated as insignificant, whose intelligence he'd dismissed, whose very existence he'd barely acknowledged, was about to deliver a report that would determine the future of his family's company. "I understand you're dealing with a crisis involving the Peterson Industries account," I continued, setting my briefcase on the table and opening it to reveal a thick folder of documents. "I'd like to discuss how this situation, along with my other findings, impacts Blackstone's potential acquisition offer." Derek Sr. gestured to an empty chair at the head of the table. "Please, have a seat. We're very interested in hearing your assessment." As I walked to the chair, I passed directly by Derek Jr., who was still staring at me with an expression of absolute disbelief. For 8 months, he'd looked right through me. Now, he couldn't look away. I sat down and opened my folder, revealing months of careful documentation, financial analysis, and strategic assessment. Every dismissive comment Derek Jr. had made about the coffee girl was about to come back to haunt him in the most spectacular way possible. "Let me begin," I said, looking directly at Derek Jr. before turning to address the rest of the board, "by discussing the systematic leadership failures that have led to this crisis." The morning fog outside had lifted, and bright sunlight was now streaming through the conference room window. But inside that room, Derek Jr. was experiencing the darkest moment of his professional life. He had spent 8 months treating me like I was invisible, never imagining that I was actually the one person in the building who truly saw everything. And now, it was time for him to learn just how costly his arrogance had been. I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's presentation system. The first slide of my comprehensive report appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. Meridian Technologies, a complete strategic assessment. Derek Jr.'s coffee cup finally completed its journey to the table, landing with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the stunned silence of the boardroom. The real meeting was about to begin. The tension in the boardroom was palpable as I clicked through my presentation slide. Each chart, graph, and analysis represented hours of careful observation, and I could feel the weight of every board member's attention focused on my words. But it was Derek Jr.'s reaction that held my attention most. He sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and growing horror as the implications of my presence began to sink in. "Over the past 8 months," I began, my voice steady and professional, "I've had the unique opportunity to observe Meridian Technologies from the ground level. My position allowed me to interact with employees from every department, witness daily operations firsthand, and document patterns of behavior that might not be visible from traditional executive assessments." Derek Sr. leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. "And what did you observe, Ms. Chen?" I clicked to the next slide, which displayed a comprehensive organizational chart overlaid with efficiency metrics. Meridian Technologies suffers from several critical structural problems. First, there's a significant disconnect between upper management and operational staff. Second, decision-making processes are heavily centralized around a small group of executives, who often lack direct insight into day-to-day operations. Third, and most critically, there's a culture of nepotism that has placed unqualified individuals in positions of significant responsibility. Derek Jr. shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I could see him glancing nervously at his father. The other board members were taking notes, their faces grave as they processed my assessment. "Can you be more specific about these structural problems?" asked Margaret Fitzgerald, the company's chief financial officer, who I'd observed from the coffee station but had never formally met. "Certainly." I clicked on a slide, titled Case Study, Peterson Industries Account Management. Derek Jr.'s face went ashen. The recent loss of the Peterson Industries contract provides an excellent example of how these systemic issues manifest in real-world consequences. I had spent considerable time preparing this section of my presentation, knowing it would be the most damaging to Derek Jr. personally. Every conversation I'd overheard, every observation I'd made, every piece of evidence I'd gathered was about to be laid bare in front of the people who controlled his future. The Peterson account represented approximately 30% of Meridian's annual revenue, I continued, displaying financial projections on the screen. The relationship with this client required delicate handling, particularly given their known price sensitivity and the competitive landscape they operate in. Derek Jr. tried to interject. "Look, I can explain." "Please let Miss Chen finish," Derek said sharply, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. I nodded politely and continued. "Through my observations, I documented a pattern of increasingly problematic interactions between Meridian's account management team and Peterson Industries. The approach taken was confrontational rather than consultative, dismissive rather than collaborative, and ultimately counterproductive." The next slide showed a timeline of events leading up to the contract termination. I'd constructed it from overheard phone conversations, fragments of meetings I'd witnessed, and the emotional reactions of various employees who had been involved in the account. On Tuesday morning, I personally witnessed the final conversation that led to the contract termination. The account manager's approach was to essentially issue an ultimatum to the client: accept the new pricing structure or find another firm. This strategy directly contradicted everything we know about Peterson Industries' corporate culture and decision-making processes. Derek Jr.'s hands were clenched into fists on the table. You don't understand the full context of that conversation." I looked directly at him for the first time since beginning my presentation. "I understand more context than you might think, Mr. Whitney. For 8 months I've been observing your interactions with colleagues, clients, and staff. I've documented your management style, your communication patterns, and your decision-making processes. The Peterson Industries situation wasn't an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a consistent pattern of behavior." The room fell silent. Derek Jr. looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor, while his father's expression had shifted from concern to barely controlled anger. "What exactly are you suggesting, Ms. Chen?" asked Robert Hayes, the company's chief operating officer. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a comprehensive assessment of leadership effectiveness across different departments. "I'm suggesting that Meridian Technologies has a fundamental leadership problem that extends beyond any single account or individual mistake. The company's culture has created an environment where critical decisions are made by people who are isolated from the operational realities of the business." Derek Jr. finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous. You were serving coffee. How could you possibly understand the complexities of managing major client relationships?" The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several board members visibly cringed, and I could see Derek Sr. closing his eyes as if in pain. "That's an interesting question," I replied calmly. "Let me address your concern about my qualifications." I clicked on a slide I'd prepared specifically for this moment. It displayed my actual resume: Stanford MBA, dual degrees in computer science and business administration, summa cum laude, published research, previous consulting experience, and current position as senior business analyst at Blackstone Ventures. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek Jr. stared at the screen as if it were displaying something physically impossible, his mouth hanging slightly open. "I graduated from Stanford Business School with highest honors," I continued, my voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "My thesis on emerging market penetration strategies has been cited in multiple academic journals. I spent 2 years working for Chen and Associates, a boutique consulting firm in Singapore before joining Blackstone Venture. I speak 4 languages fluently and have conducted strategic assessments for companies across 3 continents. Derek Jr. looked like he was going to be sick. So to answer your question about my qualifications, I'm considerably more qualified to assess complex business relationships than someone whose primary qualification is their surname. The comment was harsher than I'd intended, but 8 months of condescension and dismissal had taken their toll. Derek Jr. had spent nearly a year treating me like I was intellectually inferior, and now he was learning just how wrong he'd been. Derek Sr. cleared his throat. "Ms. Chen, we appreciate your thoroughness. Could you walk us through Blackstone's specific concerns about the acquisition?" I clicked to a new section of my presentation. Blackstone Ventures was prepared to offer $150 million for Meridian Technologies based on your submitted financial projections and strategic positioning. However, my assessment has identified several factors that significantly impact the company's value proposition. The financial slides that followed painted a devastating picture. I documented inefficiencies in every department, identified redundant positions, calculated the true cost of poor decision-making, and projected the long-term impact of cultural problems on company performance. The Peterson Industries situation alone represents a 30% reduction in annual revenue, I explained, clicking through graphs that showed the cascade effect of losing such a major client. But more concerning is the pattern of behavior that led to this loss. If this approach to client management continues, Blackstone projects that Meridian will lose an additional 40% of its current client base within 18 months. Margaret Fitzgerald was furiously taking notes. "What's your recommendation regarding the acquisition?" I paused, knowing that my next words would determine the fate of everyone in the room. Based on my findings, Blackstone is prepared to withdraw our acquisition offer, unless significant structural changes are implemented immediately. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Derek Sr. went pale, Margaret dropped her pen, and several board members began talking at once, but Derek Jr. just sat there, staring at me with an expression that mixed shock, humiliation and dawning comprehension. However, I continued, raising my voice to cut through the chaos, Blackstone is also prepared to make a revised offer under certain conditions. The room quieted instantly. We would consider a reduced offer of $75 million, contingent on a complete restructuring of the leadership team and the implementation of new operational protocol. This would include the immediate removal of certain key personnel who have demonstrated incompetence in critical roles. Derek Jr.'s face went from pale to bright red. "You can't be serious. You're some kind of corporate spy, and now you're trying to destroy people's careers based on your biased observations." "My observations weren't biased," I replied evenly. "They were comprehensive, documented, and verified through multiple sources. Every assessment I've made can be supported with specific examples and measurable outcomes." I clicked on a slide that showed a detailed breakdown of Derek Jr.'s performance metrics, client satisfaction scores, project completion rates, revenue generation, and team management effectiveness. Every metric was below industry standards, and several were in the bottom percent. For example, I continued, over the past 8 months, I documented 47 instances of inappropriate workplace behavior, including dismissive treatment of staff, failure to follow established protocols, and making strategic decisions without proper consultation or analysis. Derek Jr. stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane, Dad, you can't seriously be considering this." Derek Sr. looked at his son with an expression that was both sad and disappointed. "Derek, sit down. We need to hear the rest of Miss Chen's presentation." "But she's been lying to us for 8 months. She's been spying on us, pretending to be something she's not." I stood up as well, my patience finally reaching its limit. "You're absolutely right. I have been pretending to be something I'm not. For 8 months, I pretended to be less intelligent than I actually am. I pretended to be less educated, less experienced, and less capable. I dumbed down my vocabulary, simplified my opinions, and made myself smaller so that I could observe this company without interference." Derek Jr. was speechless, but I wasn't finished. "And during those 8 months, you treated me exactly the way you treat everyone you consider beneath you. You were dismissive, condescending, and often you never once considered that the person serving your coffee might have valuable insights, might be intelligent, or might even be watching you make mistake after mistake. I clicked to my final slide, which showed a simple question: what does this say about Meridian Technologies' leadership culture? The real question isn't whether I was qualified to make these observations, I continue. The real question is what kind of leader treats any employee, regardless of their position or perceived qualifications, with such consistent disrespect. And what does that say about their ability to manage teams, build relationships, or represent a company professionally? Derek sank back into his chair, the fight gone out of him. Around the table, the board members were exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their thoughts on his behavior. The coffee station wasn't just a cover, I concluded, it was a test, and unfortunately, Whitman, you failed that test spectacularly. Derek Sr. was the first to break the silence that followed. Miss Chen, what would Blackstone's restructuring requirements look like specifically? I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick document. I have a detailed proposal here that outlines the specific changes Blackstone would require for the revised acquisition offer. The implementation timeline would be aggressive, 90 days for initial restructuring, with performance metrics evaluated quarterly. Thereafter, as I distributed copies of the proposal around the table, I couldn't help but notice that Derek Jr. wasn't given one. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The primary requirement, I said, returning to my seat, is the immediate replacement of key personnel who have demonstrated incompetence or poor judgment. This includes the removal of Derek Whitman Jr. from his current position and any future leadership roles within the company. Derek Jr.'s sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the room. He looked at his father with pleading eyes, but Derek Sr. was studiously avoiding his gaze. Additionally, I continued, Blackstone would require the implementation of new hiring protocols, performance evaluation systems, and cultural training programs designed to address the systemic issues I've identified. The meeting continued for another hour, with board members asking detailed questions about my recommendations and the potential acquisition. Throughout the discussion, Derek Jr. remained silent, his earlier bravado completely deflated. As we approached the end of the formal presentation, I realized that this moment represented more than just a business transaction. It was a reckoning, not just for Derek Jr., but for an entire corporate culture that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked for years. The coffee girl had become the most powerful person in the room, and Derek Jr. was finally learning the true cost of treating people as if they were invisible. The boardroom had taken on an almost surreal quality as my presentation concluded. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the polished mahogany table, and the silence that followed my final recommendations felt heavy with the weight of impending change. Derek Jr. sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking like it belonged to someone else, while his father stared at the proposal documents with the intensity of a man trying to decipher his company's future. I think we need to take a 15-minute recess, Derek Sr. announced, his voice hoarse from the tension of the past 2 hours. Board members, please remain available. Miss Chen, would you mind stepping out while we discuss your recommendations? I gathered my materials and nodded professionally. Of course, I'll be available whenever you're ready to continue. As I left the boardroom, I could hear the immediate eruption of heated discussion behind me. Derek Jr.'s voice rose above the others, desperate and pleading, but I couldn't make out the specific words. The heavy door closed with a decisive click, muffling the chaos within. I found myself standing in the executive hallway, the same corridor I'd walked down countless times while delivering coffee and refreshments. But everything looked different now. The expensive artwork on the walls, the plush carpeting, the subtle displays of corporate success. I was no longer the invisible service worker moving through this space. I was the architect of its potential transformation. My phone buzzed with a text from James Mitchell at Blackstone. "How's it going? Board taking the restructuring requirements seriously." I typed back quickly. "Better than expected. They're in recess now, but I think they understand the gravity of the situation. Derek Jr. is not handling it well." The response came immediately. "Good. The partners are very interested in your assessment. If this deal goes through with our terms, it could be a model for future acquisitions. You've done exceptional work. As I waited in the hallway, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 months ago, I had walked into this building as an undercover analyst, prepared to blend into the background and observe quietly. I had never imagined that my assignment would culminate in such a dramatic confrontation, or that I would end up wielding such significant power over the company's future. The elevator dinged, and Margaret Fitzgerald emerged, looking frazzled and carrying a stack of financial documents. She stopped short when she saw me, her expression shifting from stress to something approaching respect. "Miss Chen," she said, approaching cautiously. "I have to ask, during your time here, did you really observe everything you documented in that presentation?" I nodded. "Every incident, every conversation, every decision. I maintained detailed records throughout my assignment." Margaret shook her head in amazement. "I knew Derek Jr. had issues, but I didn't realize the extent of the problem. Some of the things you document, they explain so much about our client retention problems and internal morale issues." "The coffee station was an ideal observation point," I explained. "People tend to speak freely around service staff, and I was able to witness interactions that would never have been visible during formal meetings or structured interviews." 8 months of pretending to be someone else, Margaret mused. That must have been incredibly difficult. It had its challenges, I admitted, particularly when it came to maintaining my cover while witnessing behavior that was problematic. Margaret's expression hardened. "Derek Jr.'s treatment of you was inexcusable. Even if you had been exactly what you appeared to be, no employee deserves to be treated that way." Before I could respond, the boardroom door opened and Derek Sr. emerged, his face grave. "Miss Chen, could you join us again? We've reached some preliminary decision." I followed him back into the boardroom, where the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The other board members were seated with their backs straight, their expressions serious and focused. Derek was still in his chair, but his posture had changed. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped and his hands folded in his lap. "Miss Chen," Derek Sr. began as I took my seat, "the board has discussed your recommendations extensively. We've also had a frank conversation about the cultural issues you've identified and the specific incidents you've documented." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "First, I want to apologize on behalf of Meridian Technologies for the treatment you experienced during your time here. Regardless of your actual role or qualifications, no employee should be subjected to the kind of dismissive and disrespectful behavior you documented." Derek Jr. shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "Second," Derek continued, "we've voted to accept Blackstone's revised acquisition offer of $75 million, contingent on the implementation of your recommended restructuring plan." The announcement sent a surge of professional satisfaction through. 8 months of careful work had culminated in exactly the outcome Blackstone had hoped for, a successful acquisition at a favorable price point. "However," Derek Sr. added, his voice becoming more strained, "we need to discuss the specific personnel changes you've recommended." I opened my folder to the relevant section. The restructuring plan identifies several key positions that require immediate attention. The most critical change involves the Vice President of Client Relations position, currently held by Derek Whitman Jr. Finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, please, I can change. I can do better." Derek Sr. looked at his son with an expression that combined disappointment, sadness, and something that might have been pity. "Derek, we've had this conversation before, after the Henderson account problems last year, after the issues with the Morrison project, after numerous complaints from staff members. Each time, you've promised to change, and each time, the problems have continued." "But I didn't know she was," Derek Jr. began, then stopped himself. "You didn't know I was what?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Intelligent, educated, capable of understanding your behavior and its consequences." Derek Jr. looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "That's exactly the problem," I continued. "Your behavior wasn't dependent on who you thought I was. You treated me poorly because you assumed I was powerless to do anything about it." That reveals a fundamental character flaw that no amount of training or coaching can fix. Robert Hayes, the COO, leaned forward. Chen, assuming we proceed with the restructuring, what would you recommend for the transition period? We can't simply remove Derek Jr. without having a replacement ready. I had anticipated this question. Blackstone has several experienced executives who specialize in turnaround situations. We would be prepared to provide interim leadership for the client relations department, while you conduct a proper search for a permanent replacement. And what about me? Derek Jr. asked, his voice cracking slightly. What am I supposed to do? The question hung in the air. I could see the other board members exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the situation. Derek Sr. answered his son's question. Derek, you'll receive a generous severance package, and will provide positive references for positions outside the company. But you cannot continue in a leadership role at Meridian Technologies. Derek Jr.'s face crumpled. This is all because of her, he said, gesturing toward me. She came here under false pretenses. She spied on everyone. She manipulated the situation. Stop, Derek Sr. said firmly. Chen didn't manipulate anything. She observed, documented, and reported on what she saw. The problems she identified existed long before she arrived, and they would have continued long after she left if we hadn't addressed them. I decided to address Derek Jr. directly. You're right that I came here under false pretenses, but everything I observed, everything I documented, everything I reported, that was all real. Your behavior toward me, toward other employees, toward clients, that wasn't because of anything I did. That was because of who you are, and how you choose to treat people. Derek Jr. looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. You have no idea what it's like to live up to expectations, to have everyone watching you, waiting for you to fail. You're absolutely right, I replied. I don't know what that's like, but I do know what it's like to be underestimated, dismissed, and treated as if my thoughts and feelings don't matter. I know what it's like to be judged based on someone else's assumptions about my capability. The room fell silent as the weight of my words settled over everyone present. The difference, I continued, is that when people underestimated me, I used it as motivation to prove them wrong. When people dismissed me, I worked harder to demonstrate my value. When people treated me poorly, I didn't use it as an excuse to treat others the same way. Derek Jr. had no response. He sat in his chair staring at the table, the fight completely gone out of him. Margaret Fitzgerald broke the silence. Chen, when would Blackstone want to begin the transition process? Immediately, I replied. The longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes to implement the necessary change. We'd want to begin with the leadership transitions, followed by the cultural training programs, and finally the operational restructuring. And you would be overseeing this process? Derek Sr. asked. I nodded. Blackstone has asked me to serve as the primary liaison during the transition period. I would be working directly with your team to ensure the restructuring meets our requirements. Derek Jr. looked up sharply. You're going to be working here? After everything that's happened? Not as the coffee girl, I said with a slight smile. As the senior business analyst responsible for ensuring this acquisition succeeds. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The woman Derek Jr. had dismissed as a nobody would now be in a position of authority over the company his family had built. I understand this is a difficult transition for everyone, I said, addressing the entire board, but I want to assure you that my goal is to help Meridian Technologies succeed. The problems I've identified are serious, but they're not insurmountable. With the right leadership and the right cultural changes, this company can thrive. Derek Sr. stood up, extending his hand toward me. Ms. Chen, on behalf of the board, I want to thank you for your professionalism throughout this process. Your assessment has been thorough, fair, and ultimately very helpful. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the genuine respect in his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Whitman. I look forward to working with you during the transition. As the meeting began to wind down, I found myself looking around the boardroom one final time. In 8 months, I had gone from being invisible in this space to being the most important person in it. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Derek Jr. remained in his seat as the other board members filed out, their conversations already shifting to practical matters of implementation and timeline. He looked lost, abandoned, and utterly defeated. As I packed up my materials, I realized that despite everything he had put me through, I felt a strange sense of pity for him. His fall from grace had been swift and absolute, and while it was largely of his own making, it was still painful to witness. "Derek," I said quietly, stopping beside his chair, "for what it's worth, I hope you learn from this experience. You're not a bad person, but you made some very poor choices. This doesn't have to define the rest of your career." He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a mixture of shame and resentment. "Easy for you to say, you got what you wanted. I got what I was hired to do," I corrected. "But I didn't want to humiliate you. I wanted to help the company succeed. Unfortunately, that required documenting behavior that was harmful to that success." Derek Jr. nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to understand the distinction. "I suppose I should thank you for not making it worse than it already was. The presentation could have been much more detailed," I admitted. I focused on the professional implications rather than the personal ones. As I walked toward the door, Derek Jr. called out one final time, "Sarah, Miss Chen, did you ever actually drink coffee?" I paused, considering the question. "Actually, no, I'm more of a tea person, but I became an expert at making coffee because that's what the job required." The symbolism of that statement seemed to resonate with him. He nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding that competence and dedication weren't limited to people who looked or sounded like him. I left the boardroom for the last time, as Sarah Chen, coffee station attendant, and walked into the hallway as Sarah Chen, senior business analyst and the new architect of Meridian Technologies' future. The transformation was complete, but the real story was just beginning. 3 months later, I stood in the same executive conference room where my dramatic revelation had taken place, but everything had changed. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been professionally cleaned as part of the building's renovation, casting bright light across a table where new faces sat alongside familiar ones. The atmosphere was completely different, energized, focused, and notably free of the underlying tension that had once permeated every meeting. Meridian Technologies had been transformed. The acquisition had closed exactly 60 days after my presentation, with Blackstone Ventures officially taking control of the company under the terms we had negotiated. The restructuring had been swift but thorough, touching every aspect of the organization from leadership to operational procedures to corporate culture. "The Q3 numbers are in," announced Patricia Williams, the new vice president of client relations, whom Blackstone had brought in to replace Derek Jr. Patricia was a seasoned executive with 15 years of experience in client management, and her impact had been immediate and dramatic. "We've not only retained all of our remaining major clients, but we've signed 3 new contracts worth a combined $12 million. The applause around the table was genuine and enthusiastic. Derek Sr., who had remained as CEO under the new structure, was beaming with pride. "Patricia, that's exceptional work. How did you manage to turn things around so quickly?" Patricia smiled, glancing in my direction. "Honestly, a lot of the groundwork was already laid by Sarah's assessment. She had identified exactly where our client relationship problems were coming from and what needed to be fixed. We just had to implement the solutions." I nodded appreciatively. The transformation of Meridian's client relations department had been one of the most satisfying aspects of the restructuring. We had implemented new training programs, established clear communication protocols, and most importantly, created a culture where client feedback was valued and acted upon. The Peterson Industries situation actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise, I added. Word spread quickly through the industry about the leadership changes at Meridian, and several companies that had been considering our competitors decided to give us a chance instead. Margaret Fitzgerald, who had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer as part of the restructuring, pulled up a financial dashboard on her tablet. "The numbers tell the whole story. Revenue is up 18% compared to the same period last year. Employee satisfaction scores have increased by 42%, and our client retention rate is now at 94%, the highest in the company's history. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. The first month had been particularly difficult as we worked to identify and address the cultural issues that had been deeply embedded in the company's DNA. Some long-term employees had struggled with the changes, and we'd had to make additional personnel adjustments beyond the initial restructuring plan. But the results spoke for themselves. "I have to admit," Derek said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "When Sarah first presented her findings, I was devastated. I thought we were looking at the end of the company my father built. Instead, we've ended up stronger than we've ever been." I smiled, thinking back to that dramatic board meeting. The problems were serious, but they weren't terminal. Meridian had a solid foundation, good people, strong technical capabilities, and valuable client relationships. We just needed to address the leadership issues that were preventing the company from reaching its potential. The conversation turned to future plans and growth strategies, but my mind wandered to the personal transformations that had occurred alongside the corporate ones. The most dramatic change, of course, had been Derek Jr.'s departure from the company. His exit had been handled with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. Derek Sr. had provided him with a generous severance package, and had personally reached out to contacts at other firms to help him find new opportunities. Derek Jr. had eventually accepted a position with a smaller consulting firm in Los Angeles, where he was reportedly working hard to rebuild his professional reputation. I had heard through the grapevine that his new role was several levels below what he had held at Meridian, but also that he was approaching it with a humility and work ethic that had been notably absent during his time at his father's company. Whether the experience had truly changed him remained to be seen, but the early reports were cautiously optimistic. "Sarah, what's your assessment of our readiness for the next phase of growth?" Derek Sr. asked, pulling me back to the present discussion. I consulted my notes, which were now kept in a professional portfolio rather than hidden in a coffee station apron. "We're in an excellent position. The cultural transformation has taken hold. The new leadership team is performing exceptionally well, and our operational efficiency metrics are all trending positive. I think we're ready to begin exploring expansion opportunities." Patricia leaned forward. "I've been approached by several potential clients who are interested in our services, but need capabilities we don't currently offer. There might be opportunities for strategic partnerships or acquisitions of our own." The irony wasn't lost on me. Meridian Technologies, which had nearly been acquired at a distressed price due to its problems, was now considering acquiring other companies to fuel its growth. "Let's develop a comprehensive analysis of those opportunities. I suggest we should approach any expansion with the same methodical assessment we used for the restructuring." As the meeting concluded, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. 9 months ago, I had been an undercover analyst, pretending to be a coffee service employee. Now, I was the director of strategic development for a thriving company, working openly with my full credentials and expertise. The transformation had been as dramatic for me personally as it had been for Meridian Technologies. After the meeting, Derek asked me to stay behind for a private conversation. As the other executives filed out, he walked to the window and looked out at the San Francisco skyline. "Sarah," he said without turning around, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said during the board meeting." I was surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "Mr. Whitman, you don't owe me anything. The restructuring was a business decision that benefited everyone involved." He turned to face me, his expression grave. "No, this is personal. Derek Jr. is my son, and I raised him. The behavior you documented, the way he treated you and other employees, that reflects on me as a father and as a leader." I could see the pain in his eyes, and I realized that Derek Jr.'s fall from grace had been almost as difficult for his father as it had been for him. "I failed him," Derek Sr. continued. "I gave him opportunities he hadn't earned, protected him from consequences he should have faced, and allowed him to develop habits that were ultimately destructive. If I had been a better father and a better CEO, none of this would have been necessary." "Mr. Whitman," I said gently, "you can't take responsibility for another person's choices, even if that person is your son. Derek Jr. was 31 years old when I observed his behavior. He knew better, and he chose to act the way he did anyway. Derek Sr. shook his head, but I enabled it. I created an environment where he never had to face the real consequences of his actions. In trying to protect him, I actually set him up for a much bigger failure. I considered his words carefully. Maybe that's true. But you also did something that took tremendous courage when the truth came out. You chose to do what was right for the company, and for all the other employees, even though it meant making an incredibly difficult decision about your own son. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, he admitted. But seeing the results, seeing how the company has thrived, how the employees are happier, how our clients are more satisfied, I know it was the right choice. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing the weight of the transformation that had occurred. I heard Derek Jr. is doing well in Los Angeles, I said. Derek Sr. nodded. He calls me every Sunday. He's different, more thoughtful, more humble. He's actually grateful for the opportunity to start over, even though it was painful at the time. Sometimes the most difficult experiences lead to the most important growth, I observed. I think you're right about that, Derek Sr. said, and I think the same could be said about this company. The Peterson Industries crisis felt like a disaster at the time, but it forced us to confront problems we might have ignored for years. As I prepared to leave, Derek Sr. had one more thing to say. Sarah, I want you to know what happened here, the way you handled the situation, the professionalism you showed, the results you achieved. It's been remarkable. Blackstone is lucky to have you, and so are we. I smiled, genuinely touched by his words. Thank you, Mr. Whitman. This has been one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences of my career. As I walked through the office toward the elevator, I noticed the subtle but significant changes that had occurred throughout the building. The coffee station, which had been my observation post for 8 months, was now staffed by a professional barista who was treated with respect and appreciation by every employee. The artwork on the walls had been updated to reflect the company's new values and culture. Even the lighting seemed brighter, more optimistic. But the most noticeable change was in the people. Employees walked with more confidence, spoke with more enthusiasm, and interacted with each other in ways that demonstrated mutual respect and collaboration. The toxic culture that had once permeated the company had been replaced with something healthy and productive. As I waited for the elevator, I was approached by Jennifer from HR, who had been one of my regular coffee station customers during my undercover assignment. Sarah, she said, her voice filled with warmth, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. The changes you've implemented in our hiring and training processes have made such a difference. People actually want to work here now. That's wonderful to hear, I replied. The goal was always to create an environment where everyone could do their best work. Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. It's working. We've had more qualified applicants in the past 3 months than we had in the previous 2 years combined, and our employee turnover rate has dropped to almost nothing. As the elevator arrived and I stepped inside, I couldn't help but smile at the transformation that had occurred. The company that had once been characterized by fear, dysfunction, and disrespect had become a place where people genuinely wanted to build their career. The elevator descended through the floors, passing the coffee station where I had spent so many months observing and documenting the problems that had nearly destroyed the company. Now, that same space was filled with laughter and genuine camaraderie as employees gathered not just for caffeine, but for community. As I exited the building and walked into the bright San Francisco afternoon, I reflected on the lessons I had learned from this extraordinary experience. The most important one was perhaps the simplest: how we treat people, especially those we perceive as having less power than us, reveals our true character more clearly than any resume or job title ever could. Derek Jr. had treated me poorly because he assumed I was powerless and insignificant. That assumption had cost him his career and his father's company millions of dollars, but it had also provided an opportunity for growth and transformation that might never have occurred otherwise. My phone buzzed with a text from James Mitchell at Blackstone. Meridian numbers look fantastic. Partners are very impressed. Ready for your next assignment? I smiled as I typed back. Absolutely. What do you have in mind? As I walked through the bustling streets of downtown San Francisco, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 months of serving coffee, enduring condescension, and carefully documenting dysfunction had led to one of the most successful corporate transformations in Blackstone's history. The coffee girl had become the architect of a company's rebirth, and Derek Jr. had learned that first impressions and the assumptions that come with them can be devastatingly wrong. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was knowing that Meridian Technologies was now a place where the next person who served coffee would be treated with the same dignity and respect as the CEO, and that more than any financial metric or operational improvement was the true measure of our success. The transformation was complete, but the story would continue. Meridian Technologies would grow and thrive, its employees would build successful careers, and its clients would receive exceptional service, and somewhere in Los Angeles, Derek Jr. would continue learning the lessons that his privileged upbringing had never taught him. As for me, I had learned that sometimes the most powerful position in any organization is the one that allows you to truly see what's happening around you. Whether you're serving coffee or sitting in the boardroom, observation, understanding, and the courage to act on what you've learned can change everything. The coffee girl had had her day, and it had been magnificent. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe, and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.